Thank you very much for taking the time and trouble to talk to us. I think your writing, your work is known to many people here. I recently read your latest book about being Jewish since Gaza, and I think it's a very important and very readable encapsulation of the crisis of Zionism and Jewish identity that we find ourselves in, and in fact, which we've been discussing all day. But I have a question related to your book that arises out of our previous speaker. We've just had a speaker who, a legal expert who outlined the case and that what's happening in Israel is genocide, and did it meticulously, thoroughly, and I'm sure didn't convince everyone, but quite convincingly. But as one can tell from the very title of your book,
yes,
not an issue you confront in the book. You barely use the word genocide.
yes.
So please tell us why, as a way to introduce us to the book.
Sure, it's a very legitimate question. I think there are a couple of answers to that question. The first is about when I wrote the book, which was, in the big kind of first half of 2024. So that was before Amnesty International, for instance, had come out with its report on genocide, before Human Rights Watch had said that there were genocidal acts, before Omer Barta, for instance, who initially was skeptical of the genocide charge, had come to make that claim. That's not to say that there weren't some who were already saying it was genocide, but because I'm not an international legal scholar, I didn't feel comfortable making the allegation, given that it didn't seem to me there was back then the consensus that has been emerging now among people who study this for a living. I think also, to be honest, given the audience that I had in mind for the book, which was really, in particular, Jews who don't agree with me, who are not inclined to believe that Israel is committing grave human rights abuses, not just in Gaza, but that it has been committing grave human rights abuses consistently since 1948. That I was trying in the book to try to find a language that could penetrate what I felt like were their kind of defense mechanisms and their rationalizations. And in my experience, certain kinds of language has a tendency to make people shut down. And so my strategy in general was, rather than using terms that I felt like people would bristle at, was to try to describe the lived realities on the ground for Palestinians and hope that that would have a bigger impact.
Thank you. Thank you very much. As you know, most of us grew up with the Jewish state of Israel at the center of our identity. It's what we grew up in Jewish day schools and in many of our homes. As I understand from the book, you did too. But a few years ago, you wrote an absolutely critical seminal piece where you switched from being a long-term supporter of the Jewish state and supporter of the two-state solution to the view that we should talk about a Jewish home rather than a state. Not necessarily a Jewish state, but a Jewish home. And you embraced the idea of a federal or confederal single state without giving too much detail as to what you meant by it. So won't you tell us why and why you think that's possible? Because the most common thing one hears is it's an unthinkable possibility.
Right. Thank you. I mean, I think, to start with the last question about things being unthinkable, I feel such a debt of gratitude to the fact that I had, as part of my upbringing, a South African experience, even though we were living in the United States, because all of our extended family was mostly in Cape Town, and I spent a lot of time there. I felt like I was surrounded for a lot of my childhood by conversations about apartheid in the 1980s. And I do think that experience of having spent part of one's life in a situation in which Jews are not the oppressed group, but in which Jews benefit from supremacy, is an experience that most American Jews have not really had in the same way. I mean, yes, American Jews benefit from white supremacy, but not from not from something which is as systematic and legalized as apartheid. And so I think one of the things that often has occurred to me is how unthinkable it was well into the, let's say, mid 1980s, certainly for the white South Africans in my family that I knew, to imagine that there would be an election that produced a black government. And yet it happened within a decade. And I think if you look at the United States too, in the 1940s, maybe even into the 1950s, the notion that you would have that segregation would end was also very hard to imagine. I think in the 1980s, it was also very hard to imagine that the Soviet Union would not control Eastern Europe. So we do have precedents for seemingly impossible systems of oppression that seem incorrigible to actually come down in the face of great moral movements. And so I think that we need to maintain this as an imagination, as a possibility, and work towards it. The reason that I moved away from the idea of partition was a couple of things. First of all, I felt that it was becoming less and less honest for me to say year after year after year that the possibility of an independent, contiguous, sovereign Palestinian state was perpetually dying. As settlement growth increased and increased. At one point, a Palestinian friend to me said to me, Peter, something can't perpetually be dying. At some point, it's dead. The reason you won't admit it's dead is because you won't think outside of that paradigm. And so I felt challenged to think outside the paradigm of partition. I think part of the reason I felt compelled to think outside that paradigm was also that as I was spending more time with Palestinians, it became harder for me to explain to them why I opposed Palestinian refugee return. I mean, people said to me, listen, how is it fair that a Jew like you could return to Israel, to this land after 2,000 years, but I, who was born there in Jaffa or Haifa or Sfat or wherever, Lod, or my parents were born there, cannot return after 75 years? And I just didn't have a good answer to that question. And once you accept the legitimacy of Palestinian refugee return, you have to, the whole notion of partition as designed to maintain a Jewish majority state starts to fall apart, right? Because maintaining a Jewish majority of 80, whatever, 75% is not compatible with the idea of letting Palestinians return. And I guess the last point is, I became more aware in the Trump era of how similar this language of demographic majority and a kind of ethno-national state was to what people were trying to create in my country. And I also felt it hard to explain why I was comfortable with a language of maintaining a certain demographic majority of Jews in Israel, and how I could then turn around and rebut people on the American right who wanted to maintain a certain white Christian majority in the United States. And I began to feel like either you support ethno-nationalism or you oppose ethno-nationalism. You can't consistently say, I support it here, but I oppose it there.
Very interesting. Thank you. I'm going to pick up again on what you said about South Africa, because I think it's important in us thinking about it. In your book, and a number of writers evoke South Africa and Ireland as two cases where it seemed a reconciliation and an end to violence seemed impossible, and yet they happened. But I want to point out a couple of critical differences and ask you to respond to that. The first is, in South Africa, we had a popular uprising. Whereas in Israel, we seem to see the population behind Netanyahu increasingly, or not increasingly, but still many Israelis behind. Secondly, the international world was united against apartheid, and that was absolutely critical.
Yes, yes, yes.
But the third factor I would say is that we reached a critical point because of those factors that I think both sides realized they couldn't win the battle. And that's when we start to talk.
Yes, yes,
so
yes.
If I'm concerned about the practicalities of a unitary state, these are the differences that come to my mind.
Yes. I mean, I would add another one, which was that Black South Africans had the power of their labor in a way that Palestinians don't have. So, I think one of the reasons that the apartheid South Africa could not do to Black South Africans what Israel is doing in Gaza was because white South Africa depended on Black labor, which meant that COSATU, the labor unions, were a critical part of the pressure that was being put domestically on the government in the 1980s. But Israel has become less and less dependent on Palestinian labor, which is part of the reason that it can move towards mass slaughter and mass expulsion and has brought in guest labor from other parts of the world. So I think all of those things are true. Um, I can't by any means say that I have a roadmap, but I do think that it's conceivable. I think one of the things we are seeing, has some similarities to what happened in the 1980s, is that there are large parts of the world now that are moving in public opinion, and even to some degree in government, especially in the global South, to wanting to put genuine pressure, economic pressure on Israel. It's harder, of course, than it was with apartheid South Africa because Israel is an economic and technological kind of powerhouse, and a lot of countries have relationships they want to maintain. But the momentum is clearly there if you look at countries in the global South, Brazil, um, uh, Turkey, others. And I think the momentum is clearly there in Europe. As in the 1980s, the United States is lagging behind. But I think that given there's a dramatic transformation that's taken place in American public opinion, and it's moving very rapidly, and not just in the Democratic Party, even in the Republican Party. And I think it is possible that in a few years you could have an American president who will really significantly curtail arms sales and be more open to international pressure. And I think if America gives that signal, I think you could see the Europeans, who have in some ways more economic leverage because of their strong trade relationship, really starting to put limitations on that trade relationship. And you could get some of that economic pressure. Now, that's not alone enough, but I think that could be the beginning of some kind of shift in discourse among Israeli elites.
Interesting. Thank you. Thank you. I want to ask you a question about the Jewish community or communities in Israel. You know, we have sat here today debating the issues, and I think all thinking about what role we can play both in South Africa and in relation to Israel,
Mm.
and how we can make our voice more heard. And clearly, we see similar things happening in the US. And I wanted to ask you how you felt about the Jewish community, and whether the recent events have given you hope of more dissent, more criticism, and more outspokenness against what's happening there. Do you sense any shift within the US?
Yes, absolutely, especially among younger people. I mean, we have in New York a really fascinating illustration of this, right? We have this young mayoral candidate, Zoran Mamdani, who supports the boycott, divestment, sanction movement. He basically is an anti-Zionist. He basically supports the idea of one equal state, not a Jewish state, which is a position that's not represented at all in mainstream American politics. And the organized American Jewish community in New York describes him as a grave threat, literally, like Jews should consider leaving New York because it's so dangerous. But we have good evidence, I think, or at least that probably Mamdani won a majority of younger Jews in New York. And it just shows how huge the discrepancy is between the official organs of American Jewish life and where younger American Jews are. There is a huge amount of energy and ferment among young American Jews in a kind of, I would say, moral and even spiritual rebellion against what they see as the fundamental immorality of a Jewish leadership that speaks about ethics and about B'Tselem Elohim and about the stranger, but in fact tries to destroy essentially anyone who actually tries to end unconditional American support for Israel's crimes. And I think that younger generation is going to do remarkable things. I don't know to what degree that's the case in South Africa as well, but I think South African Jews have a very, very important role in particular to be able to speak about the experience of apartheid and post-apartheid. I think very few Jews in the world have that kind of experience that South Africans had, where they were told, just like Israeli Jews are told again and again, that freedom for another group of people would mean their death or their subjugation. And to explain why, from people who lived through that experience, why that turned out to be a lie, I think is critically important for Jews around the world, for the rest of us to hear.
Thank you. I want to draw on your chapter about what you call the new anti-Semitism, because as you can imagine, we are all a bit bewildered by the conduct of your president. On the one hand, claiming to be fighting anti-Semitism on campuses, in quite a crude and brutal way. On the other hand, lunching with neo-Nazis and Elon Musk doing things like praising and boosting the far right in European countries. Maybe you can help us understand what's happening here.
Well, we're struggling to understand too, and we're struggling to cope and remain sane. I guess the way I think about it is that Donald Trump, like Viktor Orban, like Narendra Modi, like others, wants to create an authoritarian state. And so if you create an authoritarian state, to do that, you need to take control of institutions that are independent centers of power and independent and centers of dissent, whether it's the media, the judiciary, parts of the federal government that have historically been independent, and of course, universities, right? And so Donald Trump wants to basically cripple these universities as independent institutions. And he has a number of different pretexts. One of his pretexts has been the issue of trans athletes, for instance. That was the pretext he used to try to kind of reduce, deny money to the University of Pennsylvania. So I think the question to ask for me is, why is Trump using anti-Semitism as this pretext for his efforts to try to take control of universities and basically prevent them from being centers of independent thought and resistance? And I think the reason, because as you say, Donald Trump is by far has done more openly anti-Semitic things than any American president in 50 years. It's not even close in terms of his associations and even his statements going back for many, many decades. So I think the reason he uses anti-Semitism is because he knows it will be harder for people to oppose him. Because the tragedy is that the Democratic Party leaders and many in the media and some people even at universities themselves have conceded this basic premise. First, the premise that the Palestinian Solidarity Movement is suffused with anti-Semitism. And second, that the universities have not cracked down on it hard enough. Both of those premises are actually bullshit, right? There is, of course, individual incidents of anti-Semitism, but in almost every university that I have visited, the Jewish students are overrepresented in these Palestinian solidarity movements, right? It's just not true that they're suffused with anti-Semitism. They may be suffused with an ideology, an anti-Zionist ideology that makes many Jewish students feel very uncomfortable. But that's not the same as anti-Semitism. And secondly, the idea that the universities haven't cracked down enough before Donald Trump is ridiculous. They cracked down much, much, much more harshly than they did, for instance, on the than they did in the 1980s against anti-apartheid activism. But because Democrats and many in the media conceded the premise, it's much harder for them to oppose what Trump is doing now. And I think that's why Trump is using anti-Semitism in his efforts to bring these universities to heel.
Thank you. I think this is a very important element because we see our Jewish establishment here, sympathetic to some of this stuff because they believe it is fighting anti-Semitism.
Right.
And that's a deep concern.
Right. Right. I mean, the irony is that disproportionately, the students who are getting suspended, expelled, beaten up by the police, having their careers ruined, a disproportionate percentage of those students are Jews, right? I mean, just to give one crazy example, last fall at 10 different universities, Jewish students erected Sukkot, right? It was the holiday of Sukkot. They built sukkahs, right? And the universities tore down the sukkahs And the organized American Jewish community applauded this, right? They applauded this, right? Because they were Gaza solidarity sukkahs, right? And so in the name of fighting anti-Semitism and keeping Jews safe, you have American Jewish organizations encouraging universities to tear down Jewish religious structures. We're in this bizarre dynamic in the United States in which if you are a Jew who supports Palestinian freedom, you become un-Jewed. You stop being identified as a Jew, and you are persecuted for supposedly endangering Jews. When Columbia University suspended the group Jewish Voice for Peace, the first word in Jewish Voice for Peace is Jewish, the Anti-Defamation League congratulated Columbia University for keeping Jewish students safe. That's how bizarre things have gotten in American discourse.
Extraordinary, extraordinary. Could I ask if you have a view and you'd share your view on it? It's obviously an issue we debate a lot here. So it'd be interesting to hear your view on South Africa taking Israel to the International Court, the ICJ, charging it with genocide.
I think it was a really inspiring decision, really. I mean, I know governments are self-interested. I know that the South African government is far from pure and far from perfect in all kinds of ways. But it seems to me, honestly, it was a brave thing to do. It was a brave thing to do because South Africa surely knew that this would incur the wrath of the United States. And South Africa, is a weak country compared to the United States. But it does seem to me, again, maybe people in the room would see it differently because you would know better than me. It seemed to me there was a genuine belief that there was a moral legacy in the struggle against apartheid that this government needed to carry forward in solidarity with the Palestinian people, as Mandela and the ANC had been in solidarity with the Palestinian people during the days of apartheid. And I think it has been, I think, a beacon for the world to see South Africa do this. And when I saw the South African legal team, I mean, I mentioned it in my book, when I saw this multiracial, multi-religious South African legal team going before the International Court of Justice, I was deeply moved and inspired. And it made me think, imagine if one day we could have an Israeli and Palestinian legal team composed of Jews and Palestinians and others to speak about also to carry forth this vision of international justice and freedom, learning from their experience.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask one more question and then open to the floor, and we'll alternate between questions from here in Cape Town. And my question, my last one, is a broad one because it's really central to what we gathered here today to think about. And that is, what can we do as a minority within a minority community that's deeply concerned to find ways about impacting on what's happening in Israel, in Gaza and the West Bank, and in relation to our own community establishment and structures. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I have some, thank you. I mean, I think one of the really critical things is to keep pushing inside Jewish institutions to be open to listening to Palestinians. I think one of the most pathological things that I see in the United States, and I fear that it would also be true in South Africa, whether it's in Jewish schools or synagogues or youth movements or whatever, is that there's this constant discourse about Palestinians, but Palestinian voices are absent. It's extremely rare to have a Palestinian speaker or to have a student assigned a book by a Palestinian or to watch a film by a Palestinian. And I really think this constant talking about Palestinians without listening to Palestinians is a recipe for ignorance and dehumanization. Again, it's not so different than constantly talking about Black people, but never listening to Black people. And so I think that's one thing that everyone can do inside their institutions. I also have found in my experience that even though sometimes one can feel like one is speaking into the void, or one is speaking and everyone disagrees, I have been struck in my experience that there are oftentimes people listening who one does not necessarily expect. I get emails all the time from people coming from, mostly young people, coming from the most right-wing elements in the American Jewish community, the children of people who were Jewish establishment leaders themselves. And they say, I have been having these subversive thoughts, And I appreciate you saying things that I didn't have the ability or to say myself. You never know who is listening when you speak out. And just to repeat what I said again, I think South African Jews have a very important role to play in speaking to the rest of the Jewish world, because you have an unusual experience that most American Jews, most British Jews, most French Jews, most Australian Jews, although I know half of the Australian Jews are South African, but the other half of Australian Jews don't have. They don't have this experience of growing up under legal supremacy and being told that equality equals death. South African Jews do have this experience of hearing that equality equals death, but realizing it wasn't true. And that's so similar to the discourse we hear about Israel today, that Palestinian equality equals Jewish death. And I think you can speak from your experience to explain why that turned out not to be the case. And I think those voices will really matter.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I have a question here from the floor.
Thanks for your input and also for your Substack. It's been really important to me. It's helped me keep a perspective week by week,
Thank you.
particularly since the war began. My question is, it's really to ask you to elaborate on your concept of the unitary state and the Jewish home, and what that would look like legally, practically, what it is you have in mind.
Thank you. So there have been others who've written in greater detail about this, but I guess I would say I'm inspired by the example of the binationalists in the 1930s and 40s, people like Martin Buber, Judah Magnus, Henrietta Jolt, who very much considered themselves cultural Zionists in the sense that they believed it was critically important to have a Hebrew-speaking Jewish population that could be a kind of a culture light for Jews around the world, do a kind of cultural production that would be very valuable for Jews. But they ultimately believed that Jews would be safer alongside Palestinians who had equality than Palestinians who had been expelled en masse or Palestinians who were being oppressed, because the oppression of violence and expulsion ultimately leads to counter-violence that endangers everybody. I think that one model of in this kind of system is one in which you have autonomy at local level. So in Bnei Brak, for instance, the educational system is not going to look exactly the same as it's going to look in Tulkarm or Qalqilia, right? That in majority Jewish areas, you could have Hebrew as the dominant language of instruction with Arabic as the second language, and vice versa in majority Palestinian areas. Again, we have examples of this for instance, in Canada, which is a binational state, or in Belgium. You also see in Belgium, you have a kind of consociational democracy, which means that basically to change the constitution in Belgium, which is divided between Flemish and Walloons, you need buy-in from both populations in order to change the constitution. You have similar kind of dynamics in Northern Ireland, where you can't, a bare majority of one group can't make constitutional level changes. I think there are ways of doing that, which in addition to a very, very strong individual rights in a constitution, this combination of some form of what's called consociational democracy, which means you need buy-in from both groups to make constitutional changes, plus a strong Bill of Rights, plus federalism, which allows people to have some local autonomy in their communities, and a recognition that this is a country of Jews and Palestinians, where you have two national languages, where the public calendars of Jews and Muslims and Christians are all respected, where you have an obligation to Jews around the world who are in distress, and you have an obligation to Palestinians around the world who are in distress. I think we see bits and pieces of this kind of model if we look at other binational states, whether it be Belgium or Canada or Northern Ireland.
Thank you. Cape Town, a question?
I don't know if
Go ahead.
okay, there we go. Thank you, Peter, for your presentation and for your work in general. I'm a big fan of it. I really appreciate, I haven't had the chance yet to read your book. I've essentially spent the last 22 months being a full-time Jewish anti-Zionist organizer locally. And I appreciate your thoughtfulness about communication strategy and who needs to be spoken to in what way and how to engage from a place of empathy and understanding to connect with our community. And my experience in the past 2 years has been that wherever I've been able to have these conversations, whether the person is liberal Zionist, non-Zionist, right, whatever, there's been some ability to engage. The challenge that I'm facing is that we sort of have a small leftist group that's vocal and a small right-wing group that controls the institutions.
Yes.
And then the general assumption that everyone else is with the right. And I think by and large, that's probably true. But that sort of huge everyone else is mostly hiding. Now, my impression is that in the US, you've been very successful, groups like JVP and if not now, have been very successful over the past decade or so of unearthing those hiding people. And so my question to you is if you have any advice about how to do that, because it's one thing to have a strategy for how to talk to people once you have them in the room, but how to get the people who aren't in the room to enter the discourse. Do you have any advice about that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, look, it's easier in the United States in some ways because American Jewry is so large and so, in a way, non-institutionalized that there really isn't such a thing as the American Jewish community. There are lots of American Jews in different places. And so the social stigma is not as great in America of taking these positions. And it's a little bit easier to create your own counter institutions because you have more people and many people are more disconnected from the traditional Jewish institutions than in a smaller and more traditional Jewish community, which has a stronger, let's say, center, whether that's Australia or South Africa or Canada or Britain. But I think a lot of what a group like If Not Now in particular has done has maybe not made inroads with that people in the center you're talking about, but with their children, really. They have essentially taken advantage of this massive generational divide. And I often think it is actually through the children that you can often influence the older generation. This was a big feature actually in the anti-war movement of the United States. You know, Eugene McCarthy in 1968 ran against Lyndon Johnson on an anti-war platform because his children asked him to. Robert McNamara began to have second thoughts about the war because one of his own children was an anti-war activist. What I see is that younger people are less wedded to these older axioms. And as they move, they become the best advocates for change to their own parents. And so I think that's one way of thinking about it is that what I see happen in the United States is often that younger people are influencing their parents who are in that kind of center you're discussing.
Thank you. I have a question here.
Thank you so much for the important points you're making, and that last one was really helpful. I think one of the differences between South Africa, white superiority in South Africa versus in the United States and Jewish superiority in Israel-Palestine is demographic numbers, yeah?
Yes.
That doesn't necessarily mean that racism has reduced much here. It means that it's less effective. One of the things that I've wondered about is how the Israeli Jewish lobby in the United States is so effective. You know, I used to think that the United States must be controlling Israel as some kind of proxy, and then I started to think that maybe Israel is controlling the United States as some sort of proxy. And now I'm listening to Tucker Carlson and Marjorie Taylor Greene saying that, and it's very confusing. That they're the ones calling out the influence that Israel has. And you know, watching this going on, where the members of Congress are giving standing ovations to Netanyahu, almost as one person, and so on. And there's this idea that's really confusing, where there's this anti-Semitic tropes that Jews control the world, Jews have control over governments. And here, what Marjorie Taylor Greene is saying is it seems to be true when it comes to the Israeli lobby in the United States.
Yes.
And so these things become confusing. That is it true that the Israeli lobby has such a disproportionate control over the United States policy that these anti-Semitic tropes about Jews controlling the world start to become, well, what's going on here?
Yes. I guess I would say a couple of things. First of all, there is in the United States a very strong strand still of Christian Zionism, which does not rely on AIPAC and the Jewish organizations. Partly it's white evangelical Christians who believe, because of their own theology, believe that Jews need to return to Israel. There's also a huge amount of anti-Muslim feeling on the American right. And so because Palestinians are seen as Muslims, even though, of course, they're not all Muslims, but they're imagined as Muslims, there's a tendency to see the kind of Israel's fight against Palestinians or against the Muslim world as kind of part of America's struggle against the Muslim world. This has been a strong kind of dynamic, especially since September 11th. So all of that would be true even without AIPAC and the Jewish organizations. Where I think AIPAC and the Jewish organizations are most influential is in the Democratic Party, because it's in the Democratic Party where these forces of Christian Zionism are not nearly as strong, and indeed where the Democratic Party base has moved towards a much more pro-Palestinian position. But you see this huge gap now between Democratic politicians and Democratic voters. And I do think it's because pro-Israel organizations have been American Jews are an unusually politically articulate group. American Jews have been in the United States for a long time. They tend to be more privileged than Americans as a whole, and we are a very well organized community. And tragically, since 1967, really the prime focus of organized American Jewish life has been to support and sustain unconditional U.S. support for Israel. And on the other hand, partly because of this Islamophobia, Muslim, Arab, Palestinian Americans find it extremely difficult to be engaged in American politics. And so you have a vast disparity between the resources, and we also have a profoundly corrupt political system in the United States in which a small number of people of immense wealth can basically have huge impact in congressional elections in particular. So I think it is important to be able to talk about that, but I think the way to talk about that with yet avoid playing into these stereotypes about Jews controlling everything is to be very specific, not to talk about Jews per se or even Zionists per se, but to talk about a specific organization like AIPAC and say, how much money did they put into the elections last year? What impact did that have in various different elections? And also to acknowledge that there are many other lobbying groups in America on other issues, the oil industry, the pharmaceutical industry, the gun industry, that have disproportionate weight. So I think if one speaks specifically, not in kind of vague, shadowy generalities, and one recognizes that this political corruption is not restricted to pro-Israel organizations, that's the way to talk about it without playing into anti-Semitic stereotypes.
Thank you. I have one last question here in Johannesburg. No, there isn't. I don't believe so. Come through.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi. Your book, as well as the beginning of your talk, seems to be kind of cautiously or tentatively optimistic. I think your book ends on a cautiously optimistic note, and your talk today has, for me, been quite surprisingly optimistic, especially some of the beginning parts, the early parts. And kind of in your optimism, your focus is on kind of shifting global politics. So you talk about, young New York citizens voting in Zoran Mamdani, and you talk about kind of generally shifting global politics, America, even South African. I feel incredibly scared and pessimistic because I look at kind of images coming out of Gaza and seeing what's happening to young people in Palestine. And I think so much of our focus is on kind of global politics and the shifts we're seeing there. But are we asking kind of what is going to come up? What is going to grow up in Gaza and even kind of Palestinians living in Israel with Israeli citizenship, as was noted earlier? What are your thoughts on that? On what do we see beyond Netanyahu, especially if his justification is, well, we're defeating Hamas, but if you look at what he's doing, he's creating Hamas, or at least an ideology that in 10, 20, 30 years' time, these children who are now starving, whoever survives is going to be, that's their view of Israel and Jews. What is your comment there?
Yes. I mean, I guess it's interesting that it came off as optimistic. I suppose that I do look for signs of hope, but I would distinguish hope from optimism. I mean, I think hope is the idea that if we work towards something, there is the possibility that that transformations can come. But I wouldn't say that I'm optimistic at the moment. I do think that Israel is destroying the population in Gaza, and to a lesser degree, but still significant degree, destroying the population in the West Bank. And right now, we don't have forces either on the ground or around the world that are powerful enough to stop that process of destruction from taking place. And I do think that there is a possibility that Israel may ultimately be able, as I shudder saying this, but that Israel may ultimately succeed in doing in Israel and Palestine what was done in North America and in Australia and New Zealand to native populations, which is not to kill every last person, but to basically destroy them as national populations such that they couldn't resist politically or in any other way. I think that part of the reason that I focus on the external is because I think the limitations on Palestinian politics are so severe at this point. And I agree with you that the political implications of what Israel is doing for Palestinian politics would be to make it even more radical. I do think the place in Israel-Palestine where Palestinians have the greatest opportunity, even though it's extremely circumscribed, to organize politically is inside Israel proper, among Palestinian citizens. And one of the things that I think would be really important would be the development in Israel of a genuinely Jewish and Palestinian political party, a party that challenged the entire ethno-nationalist framework of Israeli politics. Because I agree with you that even if Netanyahu were not in power and you had a quote unquote more centrist Israeli government, if you look back to the last government of Yair Lapid and Naftali Bennett, it was not really substantially different in its treatment of the Palestinians. When it comes to Palestinians in the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, I think the thing that the United States and other governments should be pressing for is that Palestinians should, when this horrifying assault on Gaza ends, that Palestinians should be allowed to choose their own leaders, that it is not the place of people in the United States or even in Saudi Arabia or anywhere else to choose Palestinian leaders. Palestinians should be able to choose their own leaders, and many of their own leaders prominent leaders are sitting in jail, and those people should be released so they can participate in Palestinian politics. Do some of those people have some of those people committed acts of violence? Yes, but virtually everyone in Israeli politics has also been complicit in acts of violence, and we allow them to run for elections. Do some people in Palestinian politics reject the idea of two states? Yes, but the Israeli government rejects the idea of two states, and we still allow Israelis to hold elections. So I think Palestinians must be allowed to hold elections to choose legitimate leaders for themselves. We're not, and the United States needs to play a role in pushing for that.
And that seems to be a very good place to end today, Peter. Thank you very much for your time and trouble. I'm quite sure that I know it's hard to get your book in South Africa at the moment because it's sold out in most shops, but I'm sure it'll restock and more people from here will read it. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. It was really an honor, and I hope one day to be with all of you in person.